Shabbat morning, yes. I can ask you this.
Oh, that's good. That's a good double check. That's a good double check. So, yeah, no, and services were great today. I watched them.
Thank you very much.
So.
All right. Nice to see you.
Sunday
I'll
out.
talk to you next week, okay?
Yeah, yeah. All right, take care. Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye, take care.
That's
Hi,
my
how
newest
are
thing.
you?
You know, I'm getting older.
Good to see you.
Sitting on the sneakers.
Good to see you as well.
It's
a nice Shabbat sneakers you have.
Emails the other day. I can't even remember what they were, but they were funny.
Okay, we have Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Shabbat Shalom. We welcome you. Those who are with us here in the sanctuary, those who are joining us via the Miracle of live stream. The first time we've had Mincha back in the synagogue in a long while. We're glad to have everybody with us. Friends, we're going to begin our Shabbat afternoon service now. We'll go by turning in our Siddur Sim Shaloms to page 226. Cantor Weiss will now lead us now in the Mincha service.
Ashrei Shveitecha Jalucha Sela.
Ashrei Shveitecha Jalucha Sela. Ashrei Hamshachach Halo. Ashrei Ha'am Shadonai Elohav. Tilo L'David. Yoladori Shabbat Ma'asecha. Zecher Abtucha Yavi.
תפילת נעידה בפיו וברך בשם כצאן ומועד ואנחנו ימי אותיו יד עולם, הללויה.
ובא לציון גואל
ושפשת יעקב. ואתה קדוש יושב זה כל זה ויאמר
קדוש 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 אדוני צבאות מלוך על ארץ כבודו.
ותישאני רוח ושמע אחרי כל רעש גדול.
על כבוד אדוני ממקומו.
אדוני ימלוך לעולם.
אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד.
ויבטחו בך ידי שמך, כי לא עזבת תשך אדוני, אדוני חפץ למען צדקו יגדיל תורה וידיר.
Please rise.
יתגדל ויתקדש מהרבה, ויאמר דברי חירותי, ועמק מלכותי, בחייכון וביומכון. חייכו בית ישראל, בעגלה וזמן קריב אמרו אמן.
אמן. יהש מרבה מבורך, לעולם היה יפרח.
יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ותלה ותהלל שמי קודשי בריחו.
ברכו.
לעילם מכל פחותיו ושירתה ותשבחותיו ונחמתה אדם ינם בימיו יאמרו אמן. ואני תפילה תפילך רצון עליהם מברכתך ומפדישך ויהי בנשוא אהרון ויאמר משה גדלו לאדוני תרוממה שמו יחדיו.
Friends, please be seated. The Torah reading this afternoon is Parshat Naso. Here's a fun fact for you, as you all know. Parshat Naso is the longest single Torah reading of the year. All right, so it's so long that Rabbi Kogan's already started to working on it. We are going to begin our Torah reading on page 791. We're going to call Richard Winter forward for the Kohen Aliyah this afternoon. 791.
ותגלה ותראה מלכותנו בזמן קרוב, ויכון פליטתנו ופליטתנו בית ישראל לכן וחסר החיות סבנו אמן. הכל יראה לכו לתורה, כהן קרב, יעמוד אשר זל בן ברוך הכהן, ברוך שתהיה תורה וישראל בקדושתו, ותמיד וקבל לכם, חיים כולכם היום.
ברוך הוא אדוני הברך. Baruch Adonai Baruch Le'olam Va'ed, Baruch Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher bochar banu mikol hamim, natan lanu torto, Baruch Adonai notenu Torah.
Amen. V'daber Adonai Moshe lemor naso, et rosh b'nei Gershon, gam hem לבית אבותם ולמשפחותם, מבין 30 שנה ומעלה עד בין 50 שנה תפקוד אותם כל הבא לצוות צבא לעבוד עבודה באוהל מועד. זאת עבודת משפחות הגרשוני לעבוד ולמסע.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר נתן לנו תורת אמת וחיי עולם נטע בתוכנו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן תורה.
אמן. Was it? I think he had Shvi. We start a fresh column for you.
Bruchus in the name of our Lord.
Ruchlan
Bruchanim Bruchleel, Bayed Bruchaton Nile Hinum, Columbus, Bukabun Mikol, and Benosalon, so Bruchaton and Sena Torah.
Amen. V'nasu et riot hamishkan v'et ohel moed michsehu umichsei hatachash asher alav milmala v'et masach petach ohel moed v'et kalei hechatzer v'et masach petach shar hechatzer asher al hamishkan ve'al hamizbech saviv v'et meitrehem v'et kol kalei avodatam ואת כל אשר יעשה להם ועבדו על פי אהרון ובניו תהיה כל עבודת בני הגרשוני לכל מסעם ולכל עבודתם ופקדתם עליהם במשמרת את כל מסעם. זאת עבודת משפחות בני הגרשוני באוהל מועד ומשמרתם ביד איתמר בן אהרון הכהן.
Bruchaton Nile Hinum, Columbus, and Nosalon Torah, Samas, Vachaylam, Natambas Okenu, Bruchaton Nile Sena Torah.
Amen. We'll see you. Let's go. Avraham Chanoch and Harav Chaim David. Baruch Hu Adonai Barach. Baruch Adonai Baruch Lam Ba'ed Baruch Adonai Elohim Melech Haolam Asher B'Chabanu Mikol Amim V'Natan Lanu Et Torata Baruch Adonai Noten HaTorah B'nei Merari L'Mishpachotam L'Beit Avotam Tifkodotam מבין 30 שנה ומעלה ועד בין 50 שנה תפקדם כל הבא לצבא לעבוד את עבודת אוהל מועד וזאת משמרת מסעם לכל עבודתם באוהל מועד קרשי המשכן ובריחיו ועמודיו ואדניו ועמודי החצר סביב ואדניהם ויטי עדותם ומיתריהם לכל כליהם ולכל עבודתם ובשמות תפקדו את כלי משמרת מסעם. זאת עבודת משפחות בני מררי לכל עבודתם באוהל מועד ביד איתמר בן אהרון הכהן. ברוך אתה אדוני מלך העולם אשר נתן לנו תורת אמת וחיי עולם נטע בתוכנו. ברוך אתה אדוני נותן התורה. That's the Sephardian thing. יעמדו הגר והגולל.
Go please rise, lifting and tying of the Torah. Torah, Moshe, Livnei B'nai Yisrael, Al-Pei
בכל נתיבותיה שלום, דרכיה דרכיה, בכל נתיבותיה שלום, בכל נתיבותיה שלום.
Shem Adonai, Ginus Gav Shema Levado, Ado al Eretz V'Shamayim, David מזמור, אז מהר שמאל. מי זה מלך הכבוד? מי זה מלך הכבוד? ונוחה יאמר אשיבנו לך ולשבח חדש ימינו כקדם.
The Chatzik Kaddish is followed by the silent Amidah. We begin the Chatzik Kaddish on page 229.
יתגדל ויתקדש שמרבה וילמד ברכלותיו ויום מחותיו וחייכון ויום אחד חייכו לישראל וגליו זמן קריב אמרו אמן
Yehesh, Mehraba, Barach,
יתברך וישתבח מפועל דרבה ויתנשא ותדלת לב תולה ושמת קודשה בריחו לילה מכל ברכותיו שירתה תשבחתה ונכבתה דמרה ביומה ואמרו אמן.
Friends, we return to page 234 for the repetition of the Amidah.
ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו ולאבותינו לאברהם וליצחק וליעקב אוהל הגדול הגיבור והנורא העליון גומר חסדים טובים ויפים כה נקוב וזוכר חסדי באות מביא כל נביאים משמע ויעבור מלך עוזר משה מגן ברוך אתה אדוני מגן אברהם אתה גיבור לעולם אדוני וחי מתמתה רב להושיע מחלקי חיים בחסד מחיי מתים ברחבים ברבים סובר חפים ורופאי חולים ומתיר אסורים קיים ונתלשי נפר מיכה ברוך הבא גבורה ותמידה ומלך מלך ממית ומחיים עצמי חשועה ונאמנתה לחיות מתים, ברוך אתה אדוני מחיי המתים.
נקדש את שמך בעולם, כשם שמקדישים אותו בשמרום, ככתוב על יד אביך וקרא זה ויאמר.
ככתוב על יד אביך וקרא זה ויאמר.
קדוש 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 אדוני צבאות מלוך על הארץ כבודו.
ומתם ברוך ימינו.
אדוני ממקומו.
ולדברי קודשך כתוב לאמור.
לעולם אלוהי ציון לבדור, הללויה.
ימלוך אדוני לעולם אלייך ציון לדור ודור, הללויה לדור ודור נגיגת לך. ולנצח נצחים קדושתך נקדיש בשמך עליהם פינות ימשול למד. כי ימך על כל שעת ברוך אתה אדוני האלך הטוב.
Friends, we're seated.
אתה אחד בשמך אחד מגמך ישראל, דורך בארץ וגדול ותר ישוע, יום מנוחה קדושה מחלתת אברהם יגה, יצחק ירענן, יעקב ובניו ינום כבוד מלוכתה בנו, לדבר מלוכתה אמונה, מנוחת שלום ושלום ובאשקט ובטח, מנוחה שלם שאתה רוצה בה, יכיר בניך וידגים לכבודתם, ויום מנוחתם יקדישו את שמך. אלוהינו ולאבותינו, רצי במנוחתנו, קדשי מצוותיך ותחי בתורתך, שא בעינינו וטובך, שמחי משובתך, ותעל לבנו ולעבדך באמת. והנחילנו אלינו באהבה ורצון, שבת קודשך, ביום ויסור לבך שמך, ברוך אתה אדוני מקדש השבת. רצי אדוני אלינו בעמך ישראל, ובתפילתם ושבת אבות על דביר ביתך. ותפילתם ביהדותך וברצון, ותהי לרצון תמיד עבודת ישראל עמך, ותחזינה עינינו, בשובך לציון ברחמים, ברוך אתה אדוני, המחזיק שכינתו לציון, מודים אנחנו לו, שעתו מלאים לבתינו במרצו יצחיים רבים, על חיינו מסורים בדרך ותשבחים רבים. המרחם כבודם. יעל כולם נתברך ותורם שכל אותם לבועד בכל החיים ידעו הסלע ועלו את שמך ויאמן האל ישבתנו תנסלע ברוך אתה אדוני הטוב שמך ולך נא להודות שלום רבי על ישרמך תשים כי אתה ומלך כל שלום וטוב בעיניך לברך את עמך ישראל בכל שעה בשלומך ברוך אתה אדוני, המברך את עמו ישראל בשלום.
Amen. We turn to page 247.
יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, ויאמר דברך לטב ימורתה וחייכון ימיכון. חי לך בית ישראל בגלות מה קריב ימרו. אמן. יש שמי רבה מברך. יעלם אל מעל מיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתהלל שמי לקודשה בריך יעלה מקבחתה ושירתה תושבחתה ונחמתה דמירם ביומה ויאמרו אמן תתקבל סלוטן ואותן לכל ישראל כתם אבון ובשמיה ויאמרו אמן יהי שלום רב במשמעי וחיים עלינו וכל ישראל ויאמרו אמן עושה שלום בברמה ויעשה שלום עלינו כל ישראל ויאמרו אמן עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצא בראשית. לא עשנו חיי ארצות, ולא שמנו כמשפחות ואדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגאור עלינו ככל עמונם, ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים. לפני מלך מלכי המלאכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא
שמיים יוסד ארץ אמת מלכינו אפס זולתו
תחת בזך אדוני מלוך עולם ועד ונאמר והיה אדוני מלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו אחד.
Page 249, the Mourner's Kaddish. Yitgadal v'yitgadash Mehraba.
Amen.
V'alma divrach yirutei v'yamlich malchutei v'chayechon v'yamichon v'chayei d'chol Beit Yisrael ba'agala u'bizman kariv v'imru amen.
Amen, Yesh.
Yehesh Mehraba mevorach l'olam l'omel maya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh v'yithadar v'yitalev v'yithalal shmei d'kudsha brichu le'ela min kol birchata v'shirata tushbechata v'nechemata d'amiran be'alma v'imru amen. Yehesh shalom harabba min shemaya v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. Oseh shalom b'ramav hu yaseh shalom Aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru amen. You may be seated.
Belong to you.
Shabbat Shalom, everyone. And welcome you all to our annual Tikkun Leil Shavuot, our annual evening of Torah study, celebration of Shavuot, the holiday that literally celebrates the giving of the Torah. In fact, the very liturgy for the day calls it Zman Matan Toratenu, that literally the time of the giving of the Torah, to which a famous Hasidic rabbi once commented, the Torah was given long ago, but we receive the Torah every day, which is actually a very nice way of looking at it. So the tradition of Tikkun emerged in the Middle Ages to study that which we are celebrating. Because remember, at the end of the day, it's not the food, even though that's important. It's not the culture, even though that's very important. It's the Torah that distinguishes the Jewish people from the other nations of the world. Folks, there is not a culture on the world, there's not a culture, an ethnic group, a religion that doesn't believe in some way they're special, they're unique. One of the great teachings of Judaism is that what distinguishes a nation doesn't make them better, but nonetheless distinguishes them. Again, it's the Torah that distinguishes us. It's the Torah that makes us different. Which is why Shavuot is such an important holiday. So we're about to begin the Tikkun by calling Dr. Razi Weiss forward for the first session. Razi needs no introduction. I want to thank Razi for not only leading the first session tonight, as she has done for so many years, but her help in bringing it back, the Tikkun back into the building after a 2-year hiatus because of the pandemic. One last note, if you don't mind. For 21 years now, I've made it my custom to remember our dear friend, late Debbie Kaplan, blessed memory, when we've gathered for the Tikkun. Debbie, the late wife of our dear member Harold Kaplan, who passed away on 9/11, 21 years ago, was always here at the Tikkun Leil Shavuot. Big part of our religious and administrative life of the congregation. But of all the events, she really loved our Tikkun Leil Shavuot. We miss her tonight as we missed her all these years. May her memory be a blessing. Let's say together, Amen. Without further ado, for our first session, we'd like to invite Razi forward. And friends, with your permission, those who will be presenting tonight from the Amud, because we'll be presenting for a period of time, they'll be removing their masks and then replacing the mask when they're sitting down in the pews with all of you. So we appreciate everyone's cooperation with that. Razi, if you would.
Well, I know who I am. Good Shabbos, everyone. When the rabbi approached me and asked me if I would speak this year, and I said yes, and then he asked me what I would speak about, I said, how about Shavuot? A novel idea on Shavuot. And so I wanted to speak about Shavuot because I've been reading a very interesting work by a medieval Jewish philosopher named Chasdai Kreskas, who has become an important figure in my life. And he has some very interesting things to say about the relationship between Shavuot and Pesach. So that's going to come towards the end of the lecture. I want to set it up first, but that's going to be the highlight of the lecture, some very interesting and innovative things that Chasdai Kreskas had to say. He lived in Spain from 1340 to 1410. He lived through horrible massacres of the Jews that decimated the Spanish community. His own son was killed in those massacres, his only son, but he remained a stalwart Jewish rabbi and a pillar of the community, and was also very well respected in the royal court and had a royal appointment. Okay, so I wanted to start by asking what is problematic about Shavuot that needs addressing. And I was thinking that we have things that are so ingrained in our Jewish lore that we assume that they're in the Torah when they really aren't. So, for example, I remember the year that it struck me when we were reading the Haggadah on Pesach that early on in the Haggadah we say that Abraham's father, Terach, was a worshiper of idols, and then Abraham was taken from beyond the river, presumably the Euphrates River, and brought to this side of the river and accepted God, and we know the rest of the story. And I always assumed that this story about Abraham and his father and the idols and all of that was in the Torah, in Genesis, where there's the story of Abraham. But of course, it isn't there. And I remember the year that it struck me that, what? How could this story not be here? It's just so much a part of what we believe about Abraham having been the first to be the monotheist who rejected his father's idolatry. There is a source in the Bible, actually the source is in Joshua chapter 24, where Joshua gathers the people and he tells them this history of the Jewish people in like 3 verses. But the story itself is not in the Torah. So what's interesting about Shavuot is that the main thing that we associate with Shavuot is also not in the Torah. There is no mention in the Torah that Shavuot has anything to do with the giving of the Torah. Absolutely no mention. And it's so ingrained in us that we can't even imagine that the Torah says nothing about Matan Torah, the giving of the Torah, having taken place on Shavuot. Shavuot is not associated at all in the Torah with this major historical event, which is, I think, surprising. It's so much a part of the way we think about Shavuot. It's in our liturgy, for sure. We say Zman Matan Toratenu, the time of the giving of our Torah, when we talk about Shavuot. And the first day of Shavuot, what is the Torah reading? It is the 10 Commandments. So it's really part of what we think of when we think of Shavuot, yet it has no biblical source. There's another interesting feature of Shavuot that has no biblical source but has become standard. And that is one of the names of Shavuot, which is Ceret, which also has no biblical source. I remember there was in one year in the quiz, the Tikkun Leil quiz, one of the questions was, what are the biblical names of Shavuot? And one of the answers was Ceret. And I knew, by coincidence, I had just looked it up, I knew that that wasn't so, that the only holiday that's called Ceret in the Torah is Shmini Atzeret. So we have these two puzzles. We have the puzzle of why Shavuot became associated with Matan Torah when there's no such biblical source. And the second question of where did this name of Ceret come from if that too has no biblical source? So I think it's fair to start off by saying that our Judaism is rabbinic Judaism. It's not biblical Judaism. It's Judaism as interpreted for us through the lens of the rabbis. And so some of these things that are core beliefs of ours are actually rabbinic beliefs and are not traceable directly to the Torah. So my question is then, what did the rabbis find lacking in the biblical account of Shavuot that they felt needed to be supplemented by these two things? First of all, by associating Shavuot with Matan Torah, and secondly, by giving it the name Ceret. I think two things in particular. One thing is that, biblically speaking, Shavuot doesn't commemorate any particular historical event. So, unlike the other two Shalosh Regalim, the other two of the three pilgrim festivals, Pesach and Sukkot, each of which in the Bible is said to commemorate a specific historical event. Pesach commemorates the actual exodus from Egypt, and Sukkot commemorates the dwelling in booths that happened in the wilderness on the way from Egypt to the Promised Land. There is nothing that is associated with Shavuot, no historical event that is associated with Shavuot in the Torah itself. That may seem like an important lapse in the Torah that needed to be plugged up, so to speak. And I should add that there are no rituals attached to Shavuot. There are no booths to sit in, no Sukkot to sit in, no lulav and etrog to take, no clean your house of chametz, no eating matzah. There's nothing like that associated with the festival of Shavuot, and that may also have been felt to be something lacking in the description of Shavuot in the Torah and needing to be supplemented in some way. Also, and this is the second point, Shavuot is, because it has no historical association, it turns out to be a purely agricultural holiday. So both Pesach and Sukkot are also agricultural holidays, but they're not solely agricultural holidays. And here we have the third of the three pilgrim festivals being a purely agricultural holiday, and one can see that the rabbis would be uncomfortable with that and would want to turn it into, like its counterparts of Sukkot and Pesach, turn it into a holiday that has both an agricultural aspect and a historical aspect. And so, even though there are several names in the Torah for Shavuot, there's Shavuot, there's Chag HaKatzir, the festival of harvest, it's the wheat harvest, and also Yom HaBikurim, which means the day of the first fruits. And it's actually not the case that you had to bring the first fruits on Shavuot. It was the first day that you could bring the first fruits. You could bring it any time between Shavuot and Sukkot. Nevertheless, the name Yom HaBikurim enters into our liturgy as well. In the Musaf service, if you want to look, it's on page 173. You can see that the way Shavuot is referred to when it's describing which offerings are brought to the temple on the various holidays, it's Uviyom HaBikurim, and on the day of the first fruits. But the other phrase that has gotten into the liturgy is Zeman Matan Toratenu. Right? So again, not biblical, but nevertheless so ingrained in our thinking about Shavuot that it forms a major part of our liturgy. So not only in the Kiddush, but in all four services on Shavuot, we say Zeman Matan Toratenu. In the prayer that goes, Vatitan lanu Hashem Elokeinu b'ahava, moedim l'simcha, chagim zmanim l'sason, et yom chag HaShavuot hazeh, Zeman Matan Toratenu. If you want to look at that, that's on 170. So in the same, you can find it in the same in the same service. So it's really quite interesting that it became so prominent, and it took this place in our liturgy and in our thinking, when in fact, as we've said already many times, it has no biblical origin. And in fact, we don't find a reference to Shavuot being connected with Matan Torah till rather late. Our first clear reference to it is in the Talmud in Pesachim, and before we're talking about 3rd century of the Common Era, so that's really quite late. We find in our ancient sources, like in Philo and in Josephus, they talk about Shavuot, but there's not a word about Matan Torah. So this was actually a rather late association. It does kind of fit the dates of when Shavuot is. I'm not saying it's completely invented, but it is interesting that the Torah makes no mention of this. So we have to ask ourselves at this point, why then did the rabbis associate Shavuot with Matan Torah? And it seems pretty clear that they wanted to give it a historical event to commemorate, give it historical significance, and not leave it at the level of a purely agricultural festival. There's actually a debate in the Talmud about which day is the day that Matan Torah took place, that the revelation at Sinai took place. Was it on the 6th of Sivan, which would make it correspond to Shavuot, or was it on the 7th of Sivan? There's general agreement that the Israelites arrived at the scene of Mount Sinai on the 1st day of Sivan. Then there were several days of preparation before the revelation actually took place, but there's also complete agreement that the revelation took place on Shabbat. So depending on whether they arrived on Monday or Tuesday, that would determine whether it was on the 6th or the 7th that they actually received the Torah. I found one interesting explanation for why we say Zeman Matan Torotenu, the season of the giving of the Torah, as opposed to Yom Matan Torotenu, the day of the giving of the Torah. And this explanation said, because we don't know exactly what day the Torah was given on. At first, for a minute, I thought that was a really good explanation, but then I realized we also say in that very same prayer where we say Zman Matan Toratenu, we also say about Pesach, Zman Cherutenu, so the season of our redemption, even though we know very well which date was the date of Pesach. And for Sukkot, we say Zman Simchatenu, the season of our joy. So anyway, that answer kind of fell apart for me. Okay, so let's turn now to the question of why the rabbis called it a Ceret. Okay, so it seems at first glance, rather obviously, that what they were trying to do was to make a parallel between Sukkot and Pesach. Sukkot is a 7-day festival, and right after it, there's a 1-day festival called Shmini Atzeret that is a kind of capstone of that original 7-day festival. So they did the same thing with Pesach, right? They looked at Pesach and they said, oh, here we have a 7-day festival. Then there's this thing called Shavuot, which is a 1-day festival. Why not have this 1-day festival be the equivalent or the parallel to Shmini Atzeret that is related in that way to Sukkot? Let this be the capstone to Pesach. And not only that, but there's a connection between the two because they're connected through Sfirat HaOmer. Okay, so we have already a connection between Pesach and Shavuot, and so this was a way of saying, okay, so after this bridge that connects them, then the Atzeret of Pesach, which is Shavuot, comes on the scene. So we have this very nice parallel. But there's another reason that the rabbis call it Atzeret, and that is because there's no spiritual dimension to Pesach alone. Pesach alone was the physical redemption or the physical liberation from slavery, from hard labor. But it wasn't a spiritual experience, it was a physical experience. In order for it to achieve this spiritual dimension, there had to be a goal in that liberation. It had to be moving towards something spiritually elevating. And if you see just the release from slavery without connecting it to this revelation at Sinai, you lose the spiritual reason, the spiritual goal, the spiritual purpose of the liberation from slavery. So by calling this Shavuot Ceret, the rabbis were able to say that liberation was not merely a physical liberation, but it was the throwing off of the yoke of slavery in order to accept the yoke of the Torah, in order to accept God as our master instead of the human master. Okay, so this will bring us to Kreskas that I wanted to talk to you about tonight. Kreskas also accepts this answer that I just gave you for why the rabbis call it Atzeret. He too sees in Shavuot the culmination of a physical event in something spiritual. So he sees the bridge of the Omer as connecting a merely physical liberation to a spiritual elevation. But he has another reason, and this will take us into what is unique, brilliant, original about Chasdai Kreskas. He has not only very interesting Jewish views, but he has very interesting philosophical views. And some of his views are actually, as far as I can tell from what I know of philosophical thinking in the medieval period, some of his views are truly his own, are truly unique. They aren't borrowed from anyone, they aren't copied by anyone, they are really his own. And this view of his that I'm about to present to you is found in two places. One place is his magnum opus, which is called Light of the Lord, which is about 400 pages in Hebrew. It's even way longer than that in English. It's a really magnificent work. But in the 1980s, a work of his that had been lost was discovered. We call it the Passover Sermon. It's 40 or 50 pages long, so I doubt that it was a sermon that was delivered in shul, even on Shabbat HaGadol, when people gave very long sermons. But and it's very complex, so it's hard to imagine the venue in which it was presented. But it's a very interesting work. It has two parts. The first part is more philosophical. The second part is halachic. It's about the halachot associated with Passover, the laws associated with Passover. So in this work, which I recently translated it, so I'm pretty familiar with it because the way to learn a work is to translate it. He starts off with a philosophical point that may strike you as odd, but maybe if you think about it a little bit, as I did, it struck me as odd as well, might start to make some sense to you. In his view, what you believe is involuntary. Okay? That is, if you believe something, you can't will yourself out of it, and if you don't believe something, you can't will yourself into it. Here was one issue that he took up with Maimonides, because Maimonides contended that the mitzvah, that there is a mitzvah, there is a commandment to believe in God, and that commandment is found in the first of the Aseret HaDibrot, when God said, Anochi Hashem Elokecha, I am the Lord your God who took you out of the land of Egypt. Maimonides understands that as a commandment to believe in God, to accept God as the one who led us out of the land of Egypt. Kreskas says you can't command something where will is ineffective. Okay, so you can't command somebody to believe if a person can't will themselves to believe. So just to make this maybe more palatable or just simpler for you, I don't mean dumber, I just mean easier to grasp. If you think about what you believe now, like you believe that you're seeing me, you're hearing me talk, you can't will yourself not to believe that. It's just something that's not within your purview to do. And the way he puts this is, if something is absolutely obvious to you, either because you're seeing it, okay, or because you've had, or because it's something obvious like 2 + 2 = 4, okay, or because it is a mathematical or logical truth that has been demonstrated to you, rationally demonstrated to you, such that you can't doubt it. You can't doubt it. There's nothing you can do about it. You can't will yourself to believe 2 + 2 = 5. You just can't do it, okay? And if there is a belief that you have where you do have some measure of doubt, you can't will yourself to erase that doubt. You can't close it up just by wanting to. It will still be there. Okay, so this is his basic, very unique, really interesting view about the will. And in this Passover sermon, he raises the question of what is the status of miracles with respect to will? Do miracles so convince you that you're powerless with respect to them, or do they leave some room for doubt? In which case, you're also powerless because you can't close that gap. You can't erase that doubt. Or is your belief a matter of will? So even though you see a miracle, so when you see a miracle, you're willing yourself to believe. So that's not possible for him. In his view, there's no such thing as willing yourself to believe. So he asks the question, well, what was going on with the miracles in Egypt? And here, like a good philosopher, he begins by defining his terms. Okay, so he's been asking about the term belief. Okay, in Hebrew, emunah. Okay, we sometimes translate that as faith. Okay, as in ani ma'amin be'emunah shalema, I believe with perfect faith, but it's the same word. Ma'amin and emunah, that's the same word. He says there are 3 things that emunah can refer to. Okay, 3 things, and unless we disambiguate the term, unless we say what are the different things we can mean, we can't answer this question adequately about what miracles can do and can't do. So, one kind of emunah, one kind of belief is what he calls da'at. And this is where something persuades you, you become persuaded of the truth of something, and you believe it, but you can see that you could be wrong. Okay? It's something you believe, you have come to believe it, but you could be wrong. You accept that you could be wrong. The second level, which he calls emunah in its narrow sense, emunah in its narrow sense is when you come to believe something and you can't doubt it. You can't imagine that you can be wrong. Okay, so for you, this is decisive, and you can't imagine otherwise. The third level is what he calls imut, from the word emet, from the word truth, and this is a truth that is verified for you. So in this category are things that have been rationally demonstrated, either mathematical or logical truths that have been demonstrated. Here, it's not a question of are you convinced, it's a question of that this thing is objectively, demonstratively true, okay? And it's indubitable, not for you in particular, it's just plain indubitable, period. And here is where he tries to discuss the difference between Pesach and Shavuot. He says that all of the miracles associated with Pesach and through the miracles at the sea, at the Red Sea, all of those miracles had the effect, they were so powerful that they had the effect of reaching level 2. They had the effect of reaching the level of emunah for those who witnessed them. Those who witnessed all of those miracles in Egypt and at the sea could not doubt the truth that these were miracles from God. That was impossible for them. The miracles were just too powerful, too strong. Even the Egyptian sorcerers who doubted at the beginning ended up saying, after the third plague of Kinim, they ended up saying, Etzba Elohim Hi. This is the finger of God. They recognized that this was no sorcery, that this was a miracle, and they accepted it. So here too, so Kreskas is saying here we have a case in which the miracles compelled belief. It wasn't a matter of will, but in the face of these miracles, there could be no doubt in the minds of those who witnessed these miracles. Okay. Do they rise to the level of imut, of verification? No. Only rational demonstration rises to the level of imut. But there's one drawback with miracles. If you witness a miracle, and as a result of witnessing that miracle, you become a believer, what happens when the memory of the miracle fades? Our memories are not as vivid as the actual experience, and as time goes by, it becomes possible to lose that belief, okay? Against your will. I mean, you have no control over this, but as your sense that this has to be true starts to fade, so does your belief fade. And the pasuk, that the verse that's associated with this, with the miracles at the sea, the verse associated with that is Vayaminu b'Hashem u'v'Moshe avdo. The people believed in God and in Moses, his servant. But it doesn't say they believed forever, or they would believe forever because of these miracles. So we're left with miracles that were super convincing, okay? And all of the Israelites, as well as the Egyptians, were convinced of the veracity of these miracles and became believers in God, but there wasn't a permanence to the effect of these miracles. And this is where Kreska says, this is where Shavuot comes in and Matan Torah. This was a miracle that was different from all the other miracles. This was a miracle that created permanence because part of the miracle was we have the Torah. We have the Torah we can't forget. We can't forget this miracle because we have living evidence of it that persists, that lives with us, that is a constant testimony to the veracity of that miracle. We have an artifact. We have evidence right here in our hands because the Torah was given to us. And it's not just a miracle that we remember, but it's a miracle that we carry with us always. So that the difference between the miracles at the sea and the miracles in Egypt and the miracle of the giving of the Torah is the difference between impermanence and permanence. The difference between a belief that is firm at the time, but not necessarily firm forever, and a belief that is not only firm at the time, but firm forever. And there's a verse that that's associated with Matan Torah, with the giving of the Torah, where God says to Moshe, "Uvecha ya'aminu le'olam, gam b'cha ya'aminu le'olam," that they will believe in me and also in you le'olam, forever. This is the miracle that is the capstone of all the Passover miracles because it solidifies and cements those miracles, the belief created by those miracles, and makes it permanent and everlasting. Okay, so thank you very much for your attention. I'm very happy to take questions. I had a lot more material, but I wanted to leave some time for questions. Rabbi? Right, that's one reason that he gives, yes. Right. Okay. That's a really interesting question. I think he's not talking about mitzvot that we were given. That in itself does not affect your level of spirituality. You could still, until you accept the yoke of the mitzvot, the fact that you're commanded to do something, they're used to being commanded to do something. So they have one commander in Egypt, they have a new commander now, they're told to do this, that, and the other. Their allegiance now is to this new commander, but the sense of that we freely accept the yoke of God, that's a spiritual plane that they don't reach until they say Na'aseh v'nishma. Until they accept this yoke of God, they are still slaves in a way, whether it's slaves to the Egyptians or just doing the commandments that they are told to do. Warren?
How successful, though, would you say was that actual transformation? Because, I mean, I don't have the chronology straight in my head. I know that at least once they say, hey, let's go back to Mitzrayim. We had it better off there. I don't know if that was said before or after Sinai. But if that transformation was actual in the moment, wouldn't that have prevented them from having those thoughts, as opposed to them saying, okay, this wasn't just physical, this isn't just a change of address?
Okay, so the question of what they want and what they how shall I put this? These were people who craved certain things. Okay? The fact that they craved certain things, whether it be meat or whatever it was that they wanted to go back to Egypt for, and the fact that their lives in the desert were not easy, right? Their lives in the desert were very hard. There were times when they were dying of thirst, right? These were serious issues for them. That needn't mean that they no longer believed. Okay? They weren't happy. They weren't happy with what was happening to them in the desert, but that doesn't mean that they lost their belief in God. Okay? And I think what Kreskas is trying to argue is that once there was Sinai, they really couldn't doubt God's existence the way they could before. Alan?
I'm trying to sort out three words: Torah, Bible, and Tanakh. When you say this, I think you were using Bible as meaning the same as Torah, as opposed to Tanakh. Because you told us that Yeshua contains the answer to the puzzle. So it's within Tanakh, but it's not biblical because it's not in the Torah. Is that the way you sort it out?
Right. So what I was trying to say is that we think this was just an example of something we think we know where it is, and it isn't there. Okay. So not to say that this was not biblical. It's biblical, the story of Terach, Abraham's father, but it's not where we think it is. Okay. And but about Shavuot, it's not anywhere in the Bible. We don't have any reference to Matan Torah being connected with Shavuot until the Talmud.
Lost again. I thought you said that there is that connection made in Yeshua.
No, the only thing in Yehoshua is the story about Terach. Okay, sorry if that was confusing, sorry. Other questions? Avram? He's quite brilliant, a Torah interpreter, quite brilliant. He says things no one else says. He's underappreciated. A lot of his being unappreciated had to do with the times, the decimation of Spanish Jewry at the time just made him go by the wayside, and it's just kind of recently that he's been rediscovered. This sermon on the Passover that I mentioned to you, that was it was a manuscript that was buried in two places. It was buried in the Harvard Library, where they have manuscripts of this period, and in the Vatican Library. And a professor at Hebrew University by the name of Aviezer Ravitsky was going through these manuscripts, and he came across this sermon, which had been filed with Kabbalistic works. It's not at all Kabbalistic, this work, and in fact, as soon as you read it, you see Chasdai Kreskas, because in his major work, Light of the Lord, many of these themes reappear, and these very innovative things that Chasdai Kreskas says in the Sermon of the Passover reappear in this magnum opus that we know is his. So Aviezer Ravitsky was astonished that here it is misfiled. It has no name on it, has no title on it, nothing. And in 1988, he published the Hebrew, the original, after doing a lot of manuscript research, and it came to light. And I guess I can tell you that my translation will soon be published in 2023, so I'm hoping that people will become more familiar with this work. He was a great halachic decisor. People from all over wrote to him and asking him halachic questions, and he was the teacher of another very famous halachist, Joseph Albo was his student, and that whole aspect of his brilliance was lost because he didn't write, or we don't have anyway, his halachic works. So the only halachic work of his that we do have is the second half of this Passover sermon. And in fact, he had intended to write a second major work. So the work that we have, Light of the Lord, which is, I mentioned, is 400 pages, he had intended to write another work, a halachic work, to rival a Maimonides Mishna Torah in the way that Light of the Lord rivals Maimonides' Guide of the Perplexed. But he was a busy man. He was very politically engaged and was needed by his community, and he never got to write that second volume. So the only halachic stuff of his that we have is this very short section, maybe 20 pages, in the Passover sermon. And it's just good to have. It's exciting to have this other aspect of him, at least a little bit of it. I hope so. He deserves it. Yes, Rabbi. Okay, so we do know that he never wrote that major halachic work that he was planning. That was going to be called Lamp of the Commandment. He never got to write that. So he mentions it, but he doesn't write it. As far as other things, we have reports of his responsa, like by later people, like Albo quotes him, other people quote him, but as far as we know, it doesn't exist. It might. I mean, there might be something. Right. Yes, I'm aware of this.
In that there has been speculation for 2 generations of scholars now that all kinds of goodies that are tucked away in the Vatican archive.
Right.
In that, you said that Harvard's got one excellent copy, if I understood you, and Vatican has the other.
Yes.
Is it possible that some of Prescott's other goodies might be filed away there under high from the Jews?
Right. I mean, just as we don't think that it was purposely misfiled. It came with no name, and they don't know, they don't know what to do with it. So that's how it ended up there. I don't know of any deliberate attempts to hide any of his written works.
As I want to thank Razy for once again sharing her study, her learning, her wisdom with us. Now, Razy is being very modest. She doesn't just know a lot about Ibn Kreskis. I had the good fortune about 1.5 years ago getting one of my favorite magazines, Jewish Review of Books. And there was an article about Hasdai Ibn Kreskis. All right. And I was very delighted at the time. Razy, as you know, is very modest about this kind of stuff, but I was very delighted to see that she had written the article. And so we look forward to 2023, when your translation of the Passover Sermon. And I've just been informed that in 2024, a major motion picture is. It should only be because I'm sure that'll pay better than what your publishers are giving you for the translation. Razy, we want to thank you very much for once again this year so generously leading the first session of the Tikkun. Friends, we're now going to begin the Mariv service to usher in the observance of Shavuot. We'd like to invite you all to please rise at this time as we call the Chazan forward. And as the Chazan is coming forward, I just want to review this schedule for the rest of the evening. Following the Mariv service, we're going to have a little bit of a shortened version of the annual Jewish Trivia Contest, our 8th annual Jewish Trivia Contest in Shavuot. And the Cantor and I are each going to do about a 30-minute session. The Cantor will be going first, and I'll be following him. So we hope that you'll be able to stay for a little while longer. And I expect that the Tikkun tonight will go to around 10:45 or so, between 10:45 and 11. Again, we hope that you'll be able to stay as long as you're able to. And we're very glad to have all of you with us this evening. Again, please rise as on page 28. On page 28, the Chazan leads us in Mariv.
The live stream camera for this event was zoomed for this portion of the bima, because of the speakers. So for Mariv, I'll conduct it from here, so that the folks at home will feel and be more involved. Et Adonai HaMevorach Baruch Adonai HaMevorach Leolam Va'ed Baruch Adonai El Chai v'Kayam Tamid Yimloch Aleinu Leolam Va'ed Baruch Ata Adonai Hamari Baraviv Avat Olam Beit Yisrael Chavta Yehem Chayenu V'yorech Yameinu ובמנהגי יומם ולילה בבטחה תשים ממני לעולמים. ברוך אתה אדוני, אוהב עמו ישראל, שמע ישראל, אדוני אלוהינו, אדוני אחד. ברוך שם כבוד מחוץ העולם. היום שבעות ישמע מצותי. יאמר אדוני משה לאמור אדוני אלוהיכם אמת אמונה פרדת כליים ומלכותו ברצון קיבלו עליהם משה בני ישראל לכנו שירה ושמחה רבה ויאמרו כולם מי כמוך באלים אדוני מי כמוך נדר בקודש נורתי לו תוסיף אלה מלכותך רב בניך בקיים לפני משה זה ליאנו ויאמרו אדוני ימלוך לעולם ועד ונאמר כי פדה אדוני את יעקב ויהלום יד חזק ממנו ברוך אתה אדוני כל ישראל אשכיבנו אדוני אלוהינו ושמור צאתנו ובואנו לחיים ולשלום מעתה ועד עולם ועד עולם ופרוס עלינו סוכת שלומך ברוך אתה אדוני הפורש סוכת שלום עלינו ועל כל עמו ישראל ועל ירושלים וידבר משה את מועדי אדוני אל בני ישראל יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה ויאמר ברכתי ויאמר מלכותי וחייכון וביומכון וחייתך בית ישראל בגלה וזמן קריב יאמרו אמן יתברך וישתבח ויתברך תרומם ויתנשא יתעלה ויתעלה ויתעלה שמי לקודשה בריחו לילה מכל ברכתה ושירתה תשבחתה ונחמתה אמירם ביומה ויאמרו אמן יתגדל ויתקדש מרבה וילמד ברכרתי וימחמותי וחייכון ויומכון וחייתו בית ישראל בחלו בזמן קריב ימרו אמן יש מרבה מברך ועלם לו מעולמיה יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ותעלה ותעלה ושמי לקודשה בריחו לילה מן כל ברכותיו ושירתיו ותשבחותיו ונחמתיו דמירם באומה ויאמרו אמן יתכבד סרטון ואותון לכל ישראל קודם אבון לבשמיה ויאמרו אמן יש שלום רב משמיים חיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ויאמרו אמן עושה שלום במרומיו ויעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ויאמרו אמן ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם בורא פרי הגפן ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם אשר קידשנו מצוותיו ורצה בנו בשבת אשר בחר בנו מכל העם ורוממנו כל השם וקידשנו במצוותיו ותיתן לנו אלוהינו באהבה מועדים לשמחה, חגים זמנים לששון, את יום חג השבועות הזה, זמן מתן תורתנו, מקרא קודש, זכר ליציאת מצרים, כיוונו בחרת, ואותנו קידשת, מכל עמים, ומועדי קודשך, בשמחה וששון הנחלתנו, ברוך אתה אדוני, מקדש ישראל והזמנים. ברוך אתה אדוני, אלוהינו מלך העולם, בורא מאורי האש. ברוך אתה אדוני, אלוהינו מלך העולם, המבדיל בין קודש לחול ובין אור לחושך, בין איסור עולמים ויום שלישי את ימי המעשה, בין קדושת שבת לקדושת יום טוב הבדלת, ואת יום השביעי בששת ימי המעשה קידשת, הבדלת וקידשת את עמך ישראל בקדושתך. ברוך אתה אדוני המבדיל בין קודש לקודש. ברוך אתה אדוני אלוהינו מלך העולם שהחיינו וקיימנו והגיענו לזמן הזה. עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצר בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי הארצות, לא שמנו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חוקינו כהם, וגאור עלינו ככל המונם, ואנחנו קוראים, משתחווים ומודים, לפני מלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא. ונאמר היה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד ושמו אחד. אמן. אמן. יהש מרבה. בריחו. אמן. 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 יגדל? יגדל.
Page page 53, Yigdal.
יגדל אלוהים חי וישתבח נמצא ויענה את מציאותו אחד ויהיה ייחודו נעלם וגם אין סוף לאט אין לו דמות הגוף ואינו גוף לא נערוך אליו קדושתו קדמו לכל דבר שנברא שם מראשית לראשית אינו אדון עולם וכל נוצר יורה גדולתו ומלכותו לא קם בישראל כמו שעוד נביא ומביט את אמונתו לא יכל להיפעל ולא ימיד לטוב לעולמים לזולתו מילא איש חסד כמפעלו נותן לרשע רע כרישתו מתים יחייל ברוב חסדו ברוך הדיית שם תהילתו
Chag Sameach, everyone. Chag Sameach. Friends, we're glad to see you all this evening. We welcome you. So again, we're going to play a shortened version of the Jewish trivia contest, and then the cantor are each going to lead a short session to round out the Shavuot evening. I hope that you'll be able to stay around for a little while. So this is the 8th year we've had the Jewish trivia contest, and because I think we'll do a little bit different tonight. We'll play the people in the sanctuary versus the people on live stream. Who's ready? Now, in case it wasn't Yentiv, we'd have one of those electric wheels going with that weird music, but it's been a long time it's a long time since I've watched a game show. I don't even play the lottery. What was the name of Moses' wife? Zipporah. Rebecca had 2 sons. What were their names? Jacob and Esau, Yaakov and Esav. Correct. Who, according to tradition, is the author of the book of Kohelet, or Ecclesiastes, as we know it in English? Melech Shlomo, that is correct. When is Sefer Yonah, the book of Jonah, read in the synagogue? Okay, good, that was okay. And you're all correct. It is read on Yom Kippur at Mincha time. Okay. How much did Avraham, our father Abraham, pay? What's that? I was going to say, how much did he pay for his new car? The full question was, how much did he pay for the cave of Machpelah, which Richard has correctly answered. I'm sorry, somebody on live stream got it before you, Richard. I'm sorry. 400 shekels. Okay. Here's a hard one. What was the name of Lot's wife? Did you see my notes before I came in today? What's that? No, this is the new one I wrote on Monday. Okay. What's that? Right, no, Jeff is correct. The Bible never tells us. She's just like pillar of salt lady, but just like Razy mentioned, there's no story of Abraham breaking the idols that actually exists in the Tanakh. It doesn't say Mrs. Pillar of Fire either. Here's a really hard one. How is Rebecca, who we just identified as the mother of Jacob and Esau, how is she related to Abraham? And by the way, those who can get this right should really have my job. Okay? How was Rebecca related to Abraham? This is real like Chidon HaTanakh. Anybody hear that term before? Chidon HaTanakh is the real Jewish trivia contest, the annual Bible competition for teenagers held in Jerusalem every single year. We've actually had a couple of kids over the years from New Jersey who have won the Chidon HaTanakh. Anybody remember Rabbi Josh Finkelstein, my very good friend who worked with us for a year? His son, who is now a rabbi, I believe was a finalist at Chidon HaTanakh. Hey, that should be one of the questions for next year. Which one of my good friend's kids was a finalist at Chidon HaTanakh? Okay, how was Rebecca related to Abraham? Close, so close. Okay. God, the rumors are true. You really are bucking for my job. Okay. She was actually his great niece. Rabbi Kogan has got it. Okay. Abraham had a brother, Nahor. Right? This was his granddaughter. Very good. Really. I had to look at various sources for this one.
Well, it's in the last few verses.
Yes. Okay. Rachel has two sons. All right? Okay. Rachel has two sons. Who's the younger one? Benjamin. Say it loud, say it proud. Okay. You've all heard of the city of Hebron, or Hebron, as we say it in English. But before it was known as Hebron, or Hebron, the Bible refers to it by an earlier name. Kiryat Arba. That is correct. What famous event happened at Beit El? Right, the ladder, Jacob's dream. Jacob's dream. Okay. Reuben was the oldest of Jacob's sons. Was he in favor of killing Isaac? Excuse me, was he in favor of killing Jacob? I'm sorry. Oh, I wrote this in my question. Was he in favor of killing Joseph, or was he not? Okay. Was Reuben, Jacob's oldest son, in favor of killing his brother Joseph, or not?
He says to throw him into the pit.
Right. He is actually not in favor of killing him. By the way, the follow-up question should be, did that do any good? What was the name of Joseph's boss in Potiphar? Excellent. How many years did Joseph remain in jail after he interpreted the dreams of the king's baker and cupbearer?
2 years.
Are there any other possibilities? 2 years is correct. Okay, now that we've finished the Bible side of things, a couple of Jewish law questions. Who were the Geonim? Okay, let's go with that. They were actually the great scholars who led the Jewish people in the lands under pretty much Arab dominion, primarily outside of Baghdad, and they were in the Middle Ages. So we're going to give you that one. That is correct. What? Oh, I see what you're saying. Vilna. Okay, great question. The Geonim refer to a certain set of scholars living in what is now Iraq in the 8th, 9th, 10th, 11th centuries. Okay, but the Gaon, as often also means in context, brilliant or genius types. Okay, so there have been rabbis over the course of Jewish history that have earned the title, or has been lovingly bestowed on them, Gaon, like the Vilna Gaon, the great genius of Vilnius, Rabbi Elijah, or what I call Rabbi Kogan behind his back when he saves me with a brilliant comment at the last minute. What is the difference between what is known as the Bavli and the Urushali? Very good. What's the difference? Excellent. Which was completed first? Which was completed first? The Yerushalmi, the Jerusalem Talmud, was completed about 100 years earlier. Okay? Which is the more authoritative for Jewish law and practice as we understand it today? Sorry? Babylonian, that is correct. Okay. And which is harder to study? The Yerushalmi, definitely. It's like almost like night and day. Okay. Okay. Were the first Sidurim, which were compiled by the Gaonim in approximately the 9th and 10th centuries, were the first Sidurim relative to the Sidurim we have today, were they A, shorter, B, longer, or C, about the same? They were shorter. And in fact, I'll tell you a little story. When the cantor and I were trying to figure out the way we should conduct our services during, when we resumed services in the building during the early part of the pandemic, we were proud that we actually one of the first congregations to resume, the first conservative synagogues to resume in-person services. But we had to take into account that we weren't supposed to be in an enclosed space for all that long. And we talked about this a lot and used some of the ideas of those early Sidurim. Now, I got to tell you, we didn't make it as short as those early, we didn't make it as brief as those one, but we had conversations where we incorporated some of the, what did the shorter service in the time of the Gaonim actually look like? Last question for the, last one or two questions. In addition to the Torah, what other classic Jewish text did Rashi, the great Torah commentator, write a commentary on? Excellent. You guys are doing great tonight. I want to thank you for joining us. I can assure you that, well, I think that we beat the folks joining us on live stream. Though those of you who join us on live stream, you can let me know after the Yontif how you did. I want to thank you for this, and God willing, we'll have many opportunities to compete in this fashion in the future. Now we're going to invite the Chazan forward to lead us in his session. Again, the cantor session and my session will each go for about 30 minutes each, so we hope that you'll be able to stay for the duration.
I'm imagining that the sheets in your hands are easier to read than these. This setup is mainly for the people in the live stream, so hopefully they can see this and make use of it. Okay. Good Yontif. Good to be here. The title of this talk is Spelling the Numbers and Counting the Letters, Numerology and Word Symbolism in Jewish Lore. The idea for this session came to me after recently viewing an episode of The Simpsons. How many of you ever watched The Simpsons? Good, okay. From last season, 32, beginning, which takes place in ancient Rome. Anybody remember the episode? No? Homer was called Obesius. He lives a life of leisure. He owns his former Springfield buddies as slaves, but he had promised to set them free one time. When Lenny, now called Lennis, asks him to keep that promise, Homer responds, Guys, thank you so much for bringing this up. I'm really lucky to own friends like you. Tell you what, I'll have my accountant crunch the letters and we'll circle back. The important thing is we started a conversation. So not too many people either got that joke or if they got the joke, kid thought it was funny. I thought it was hilarious to crunch the letters of the Roman numeral system. Huh? It's a riot, but they say it so fast that there's no laugh lines, no laugh tracks. So most people. No, the reason I know that this was not a big hit because I tried Googling it. Afterwards, I found it on one page. That's before the transcripts came out. Anyway, since the Roman numeral system uses only 7 Latin letters to form any number, yeah. I, V, X, and I don't have enough fingers for L is 50, C is 100, D is 500, and M is 1,000. Since he only had those 7 letters, Homer's accountant had some serious crunching to do. On the other hand, classical Hebrew number crunchers used a more comprehensive system called the Alphabetic numeral system, which was actually borrowed in the late 2nd century BCE from a similar Greek system where the letters had numerical value. In this case, meaning in the Hebrew case, there are distinct numerical values that are assigned to every distinct letter of the alphabet. So whereas the Roman system is positional in that, if an I comes before a V, it subtracts, you all know that. In the Hebrew system, each letter has a number that is attached to it. Like the Roman system, it's a decimal. It's decimally oriented. So the first 10 letters have 10 numbers, and then the numbers after that get multiplied. After 10, you get 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, and the last 4 letters are 100, 200, 300, and 400. So some of the numbers have two positions in the list, and that is because the number, let's say for 20, where there's 20, there's a 500 next to it. That's because in the system that we're going to talk about in a bit that I'll mention, that system, the regular chaf is 20. The final chaf is 500. Now, this is important that in this system, it goes by visually distinct letters, so that a bet has the same value as a vet. So whether it's bit or v, whether there is a dot in the bet, it's still 2. Similarly, the various forms of the letter Vav, whether it's pronounced O, U, or V, is still 6. On the other hand, because these two letters, the final letter and the regular letters, look different, so they have different values. We're all familiar with the system, whether we know or not. Lag Bomer, the holiday of Lag Bomer stands for the 33rd day on the Omer. Lamed is 30, Gimel is 3, and that's Lag. An interesting thing happens in the numbers above Yud. This is not complete. The numbers in between 10 and 20 are represented by Yud plus the other letters. So Yud Aleph is 11, Yud Bet is 12, 13, 14. But what about Yud Hey? Would have been 15, but we don't pronounce it, we don't write it that way because that would be part of or the name of God. And similarly, the Tetragrammaton is the name for the 4-letter name of God. It consists of Yud, Vav, and Hey. We'll meet it up a little later. So similarly, instead of Yud Vav, it becomes Tet Zion. Now going back to Tet Vav, 2 is pronounced Tet Vav. If it were a word, it would be pronounced 2. And that's where we got the name of which holiday? Tu B'Shvat. So when we go to Hebrew school, we start off thinking that it's the second day of Shvat. That's English speakers only think that. But of course, there's nothing to do with 2. And the Roman system, the Roman numeral system, never became extinct. Even among people who don't speak Latin or write Latin, still use the Roman system today. You find it in copyright language. You find it in headings of chapter headings. So similarly, this alphanumeric system, although it's been basically replaced by Arabic numerals in modern Hebrew, it's still alive in chapter headings, chapter Aleph, chapter Bet. So it's similarly to the Roman usage. And also, where else is the Hebrew letters actively used? The Hebrew numbering system, somebody other than Rabbi Kogan. What if this was a trivia contest? Would you be driven to think? Okay, Rabbi Kogan.
In the pagination of the Talmud.
That's not what I was thinking of, and that's a very abstruse.
The pagination of the Talmud.
No. The Jewish calendar. The Jewish calendar. This year on the Jewish calendar is 5782, and it's written out by deleting the 5. The 5 is the myriad, the 1,000 years. We leave that off, and we just do the numbers for 782. 57. So 782 is this year, which started in September, is Tav, 400, Shin, 700, Pei, 80, and 2. That's how we write this current year. Just to show you how the alphabet is alive within the alphanumeric numbering system, is in many circles when, let's say, in the year 5751 would have been the equivalent of 5751 would have been Taf, Shin, Nun, 50, Aleph. But those 4 letters form an actual word. That word means you shall hate. So instead of calling that year Tafshin Nun Aleph, in certain circles, especially Hasidic circles, most prominently in Chabad, if you go to the archives and try to find something from the period of the year Tafshin Nun Aleph, you won't find it. Instead, it is Taf Nun Shin Aleph. So they transpose the letters Taf Shin Nun Aleph. Taf Shin Nun Aleph becomes Taf Nun Shin Aleph, which the first word means you shall hate, and the transposed word means you shall be or he shall be uplifted. Similarly, the year Tafshin Mem Daled, 5744, would be the equivalent to the word Tishamed. You shall become an apostate. So it's a distasteful word, so that year gets transposed. It just gives you an idea of that the alphabet, and we'll get more examples of this as we go on, but this is just one indication that even to this very day, the numeric system, the alphabet within the numeric system, doesn't lose its nature of alphabet, of words. Now, going back to the title of the talk, spelling the numbers and counting the letters, numerology. So numerology comes in all sorts of levels. First, we have in Jewish law the numbers. Well, numbers are all over in any culture, but interestingly, there are certain numbers that are prominent in Jewish law, and that's the number 3 and the number 4, and to a lesser extent, number 7, and as well as number 10. Okay, now 3, at the end of the, where am I here? At the end of Nila, at the end of the Nila service, remember what happens? The Chazan and the congregation says the line Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, once, and then we say Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto 3 times, and then we say Adonai is God, Hashem Hu Elohim. We say that 7 times. So there you have the numbers 1. Well, 1 is a special number for different reasons, but you have 3 and then 7. Now, 3, the number 3 is most prominently represented in the phrase Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. So when a phrase wants to be emphasized, instead of just doing it twice, in Hebrew usage, it's done 3 times. Okay, so so that's why Baruch Shem Kavod Malchuto was said 3 times, and Kadosh Kadosh is 3 times. Similarly, when we sing all over the liturgy, it used to be more common than we have it in today's usage, but certain passages would be said 3 times. Today it survives in common usage in the Shalom Aleichem. Right? Shalom Aleichem, in one setting of the tune, you don't hear it 3 times, but in the version that I introduced, Shalom Aleichem, Malachei Sharet, there in that version you hear the traditional repetition of each verse 3 times. And that's the number 3. And these 3-fold repetitions happen 4 times. So expressed 4 times. So what is the usage of 4? 4 is when there is a logical development of a thought. So emphasis is 3, and if a thought is developed, then it's 4. What I mean by that is, for instance, Ein Keloheinu, Ein Kadonenu, Ein Kamalkeinu, Ein Kamoshienu. So there's 4, and each one of those ideas are done 4 times. The Hoshanot prayers, Hoshana, Lamancha Eloheinu, Hoshana. So the first 4 letters of the alphabet are used to develop that piyut. Eloheinu, Borenu, Hodleinu, and Dorshenu. Okay, so that's 4. Another idea for the threefold repetition is past, present, and future. Adonai Malach, Adonai Melech, Adonai Yimloch, Leolam Va'ed. Okay, you have that thought repeated in Adon Olam. Hu Yeh, Hu Haya, Hu Hoveh, Hu Yeh, V'Tifara. Okay, where is a very common, prominent place for logical thoughts being developed in series of 4? Come on. On Pesach, okay? In Pesach, you have the four cups standing for 4 symbols, and of course the 4 questions. So that you see that a lot. You see it in Hallel, with the Psalm 116, Hallelu, and then the Ki Olam Chasdo. That phrase gets done 4 times. 4 times each time, using a different group of Jews to state it. Excuse me? It's 4. It's Hodul Hashem Kitov, Yomuna, and Yireh Hashem. It's 4. Okay? All right. Now, so that's a very basic kind of numerology. Now we come to a numerology that has more symbolism within it. And if we take the Shema, well, you may be familiar with the fact that the Taryag mitzvot are the 613 commandments are divided into 248 positive commands and 365 negative commands. So those numbers have a symbolism attached to it. What's the symbolism? 365 is kind of commonplace, the days of the year, but 248 is the number of major limbs, or however the rabbis computed it, in the body. Okay? Now, the Shema prayer, which talks about serving God and obeying God with all your might and all your body, your entire essence, has 245 words, 245 words, to which are added the repetition of Hashem Elohechem Emet that the Chazan does at the end of the Shema. That brings the number to 248 words of the Shema. So it's a very nice symbolism with meaning. Now, what if this explains the custom for when one prays the Shema at home or by oneself? What do? We have a preface, a 3-word preface that introduces the Shema, which takes the place of the 3-word repetition at the end of the Shema. Okay? Another area where symbolism is important is the Kaddish. Numerical, that is, numerical symbolism is important, is the Kaddish. Let's go to page 146, if you have a Siddur in front of you. But even folks at home, you'll probably recognize these words even without a Siddur. You turn to page 146 for the simple reason that 146 has the so-called half Kaddish, which is the basic Kaddish. It was the first form of the Kaddish. So this form of the Kaddish, the opening phrase, the opening clause is Yitgadal v'Yitkadash, may God's name be exalted and hallowed throughout the world that he created, as is God's wish. That opening sentence consists of 10 words. Yitgadal v'Yitkadash Mehraba, be'alma divrach yirteh v'yamlich malchuteh. That is the message of the Shema. So that is the message of Shema, of Kaddish, excuse me. And it references the mystical idea that the world, that God created the world using 10 utterances. That's a Kabbalistic idea, and that is support for that is brought with these 10 words, because the sentence says, "Be'alma divra chiruteh," in the world which he created. And that sentence is done in 10 letters, 10 words. Moreover, Yitgadal v'Yitkadash are only two synonyms for exalting and magnifying God. Further down, after the Yehesh Mehraba, are 8 more synonyms. Yitbarach v'Yishtabach v'Yitpa'ar v'Yitramam v'Yitnaseh v'Yitadar v'Yitalev v'Yitzalau. That's 8. So these are 8 more terms. So you have 8 terms of magnifying God embedded in the whole Kaddish, and the 10. Did I say 8? No, 10. 2 plus 8 is 10, and the 10 words of the opening sentence. Now, the main part of the Shema, not the Shema, the Kaddish, the main part of Kaddish is not, in certain aspects, is not really the opening, Yitgadal v'Yitkadash, but rather what? What's the main? Yehesh Mehraba, the congregational response of Yehesh Mehraba, which is based on a biblical passage. The idea of the congregation saying Yehesh Mehraba, that is the primal essence of the Kaddish. Now, that line consists of 7 words. It becomes the number 7 again, composed of 28 letters. That is a reference to the creation of the world in 7 days, and the sentence, Bereshit bara Elohim is Hashemayim v'et haaretz. That first sentence in the Torah is also a sentence like this. It's a sentence of 7 words consisting of 28 letters. So these are other levels of numerology. There are all sorts of levels like this that are interesting. The most important example of illustration of crunching the letters in Homer's terms is, anybody know? Warren, you know, you mentioned to me over the phone. Gematria, that's right, Warren. Okay. Gematria, how many of you have heard of the term gematria? Okay. It's not used often, but it's actually still has a very active life. It's an old system of hermeneutics, meaning a system of interpreting text. Interpreting the text, in this case, interpreting the text of the Torah, where we use the system of the alphanumeric system, where the letters where the where a word gets distilled into the numerical value, its numerical value. I'll illustrate it in a moment. And then the claim is made that this word symbolizes a different word that has the same numerical value. This is an old practice. It's mentioned in the Talmud. This is not just hocus pocus from the medieval period. It's hocus pocus from the Talmudic period. And it's mentioned, you're all familiar with the Baraita, the Talmudic passage of Rabbi Ishmael Omer, the 13 methods of hermeneutics, of deriving principles from biblical text. We say it before the Pesach and Shavuot, at the end of the Korbanot, etc. Well, these 13 principles are also embedded in a larger Baraita, a larger Talmudic passage called the Baraita of the 32 principles. And among those 32 principles is gematria. And gematria is a term that sounds like the Greek word geometry, but which is a mathematical term, but the truth is, gematria is not mainly, even though it uses numbers, it's not a mathematical activity. Rather, it's a lexical, semantic activity. So gematria is probably more probably related to the Greek word gramma, meaning a letter, and grammatia, like the English word grammatical. So gematria is more. Can we hold the questions to the end? I was given a very short time, which okay, so an example of the gematria is that this occurs in the Talmud of Tractate of Shabbat, in the Parsha of Vayakhel, which introduces the idea of building the Mishkan, and the notion of the 39 categories of forbidden work derives from the 39 categories of work used in building the Mishkan. So Rabbi Natan says that the phrase Eile Hadvarim, these are the words that Moshe said, or that God said. I forgot. And I'm not remembering. Vayakhel. Somebody look up Vayakhel. God said. Okay. These are the words that God said to Moshe, I suppose. All right. And so Eile Hadvarim, the numerical equivalent of Eile, simple word, 1, 30, that's 36. So where do we get the 39? Now, Hadvarim is plural, right? So 2, at least 2. So you have 2 in Hadvarim plus the Hey, the definite article on Hadvarim. So those 3 elements get added to the 36 to come by 39. I deliberately chose this example because it shows how it sometimes stretches our idea of numerical equivalent. But in a culture that lived gematria, there was no principle or method too abstract or too far-fetched to be called into service for gematria. A less far-fetched but more interesting gematria is, where is it? That in Genesis, Bereshit 14:14, Abraham, it says Abraham had 318 servants that were trained to serve him. Well, the Talmud says that Abraham only had one servant, and that servant was Eliezer, whose name, Eliezer, equals 318. Trust me, I don't have to go through all the numbers. Okay? So that's an interesting, and again, that's mentioned in the Talmud. Now, I say that is because when I grew up with Gematria, it was always embedded within, in Hasidic Divrei Torah and Shalashudis, I always associated with a Hasidic approach because the Hasidim hung on to Gematria much longer than in popular Jewish practice than in other walks of Jewish life. So I always thought of Gematria as being, a little bit hocus pocus and more recent. But when I learned that these things, that Gematria is a very ancient practice, it's kind of sobering. And speaking of sobering, the Latin expression in vino veritas, that wine produces truth, the Hebrew equivalent for that is nichnas yayin yatsa sod. When wine enters, the secrets emerge. Now, yayin is 10, and 10 is 20, and nun is 50 is 70, and the word sod is 60 plus 6 plus 4 is 70. So this statement came about as a result of Gematria, that sod and yayin are equal, and that is why yayin has the power to produce sod, or truth. But there's no aspect of Jewish law which received as much Gematria as the Tetragrammaton, the four-letter name of God. Now you have to understand that the Gematria system, what I produced here, or what I reproduced, is just one form of the Gematria system. Another form is where the letters are continuous in an ordinal fashion. 1 through 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21. That's, or should be 22, maybe I skipped one. That's another system. There are many other systems. One source has tallied up to 75 different mechanisms or methodology. To give you an example of what I'm talking about, let's say you have a word that equals 123. Well, that word can be further reduced to 1 plus 2 plus 3. So that 123 word, equivalent word, becomes a 6-number word, number 6. And basically what happens is that the decimal values get cut down. And sometimes you have words are expanded when you have this is yet another system, another methodology, when when you get your basic Gematria, and then you add to that Gematria the number of letters in the word. That is called Mispar Gadol, the great counting. So this is just illustrations. Now, the four-letter name of God received all sorts of permutations because, in the Gematria system, because one of the, yet another system of Gematria is called Miluim, which is when you take when you take a word and you have not just the numbers of the equivalent, but you take the name of the letter and you have Aleph, Lamed, Fe, and then so you augment or replace the value of Aleph. Instead of being 1, it becomes 111, Fe is 80, Lamet is 30. How am I doing? 101, 111, right? Yeah, all right? So that the letters, or bet, think of bet, yud, tav. So bet, in addition to meaning, or equivalent of 2, bet also is, tav is 400, the yud of bet is 10, and bet is, the bet is 2, so you have 412, okay? That's the idea. Now, the 4-letter name of God has, because it happens to be the words Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey, those 4 names of those letters are spelled in various ways. You can think of the name Vav. It can be either Vav, Vav, or Vav with a silent Yud and Vav. Or the letter Hey is either Hey, Aleph, or Hey, Hey. Well, depending on which spelling you use, it produces a different gematria, okay? And so the Kabbalists had a field day with the names of God in producing different numerical combination. So the most famous one of this is that if you take, going back to the basic system, that if you take the name of God, the letter, and you square each one of those letters, the square of Yud is 100, the square of Hey is 25, the square of Vav is 36, the square of Hey again is 25. If you add up those numbers, 100 plus 25, 36, 25, you get the number 186, which equals the gematria of the word makom. Makom meaning place, and makom is one of the names of God, referring to God's omnipresence, God being every place. You know it most famously from the expression at the end of a Shiva visit, Hamakom Yenachem Estchem. May God comfort you. And the word for God that's used in that is Hamakom. I'm going to conclude with this one. Of course, there are millions of examples, but this is my favorite one. The Chanukah Dreidel, the letters on the Chanukah Dreidel, Nun, Gimel, Hey, Shin, mean what? Now they mean Nes Gadol Hayasham. Originally, Nun, Gimel, Hey, Shin were the Yiddish, German Yiddish shorthand for the game instructions. Nun stands for nisht, or nothing. And Gimel stands for ganz, meaning you take the pot. And Hey stands for half, halb. And Shin stands for shtel. You put it in one. So those meanings survive in the rules of the game. But a Hebrew meaning was added on to those letters by using a system called notrekon, where you have abbreviations. You can think of it as abbreviation. Notrekon is another system of symbolism, word symbolism, that's mentioned in that Braita of 32 letters. Now, Alan, before I leave, I'm going to ask Alan Stein, what is the question you had? Not the Phoenicians. The shape of the letters were derived from the Phoenicians, and Greek in Phoenician. But the system of alphanumeric system with those letters started with the Greeks in about the year 500 BC. They do, but it's not called gematria or geometry. It's called a word that I only discovered when I started researching this, and it's called isopsophy. That's what I said. But you look it up, it's iso, iso means the same, and psophy means pebbles. So you count the number of pebbles that each word represent, and you Pythagorean system, as Razi points out. Okay.
Good evening, everybody. Glad that you're still here. We're going to conduct another short session this evening. And again, we're very glad to everybody really that you could stay and study with us this evening. So I wanted to speak about something that I've been long interested in from a subject that we're all aware of, subject that I'm sure we've all thought of, subject that's very painful. How much should we pay to redeem captives? Let's say those people who we all acknowledge to be unlawfully imprisoned. I've been thinking about this for many years, but just think of what's come up recently. About a month ago, you may recall in the news, an American Marine who was held who was unlawfully being held prisoner in Russia was recently released. Did some of you see that? Okay. There's no doubt that he was falsely arrested, convicted of trumped-up charges. And our government secured his release by returning to Russia a drug dealer who had been sentenced to more than 20 years in prison for his role in selling drugs in our country. And he was likely to have had ties to Russian intelligence as well. Now again, there can be no doubt that we're all glad to have this American citizens back home. But we found out the crimes that this person had been accused of. One has to worry what is not being shared with the American people in terms of his release as well. About 3 weeks after Russia invaded Ukraine, you recall that a star in the WNBA, Brittany Grenier, was arrested in an airport in Moscow for allegedly having some marijuana-related something or other in her luggage. Here's what we all know. The Russians will release her according to their own timetable, and our government is going to pay through the nose to retrieve her. The question of how we go about making the hard decision of how much we ought to pay to redeem captives is one that the Jewish people have been thinking about since our earliest law codes. One of the leading scholars of the conservative movement in Israel, Professor David Golinkin, who both Rabbi Kogan and I know pretty well, wrote the following some years ago. He wrote, "Anyone who has studied this topic is struck by the fact that many thousands of Jews were captured and held for ransom throughout Jewish history, and that Jewish communities went to extraordinary lengths to redeem captives. We have in our hands the Shavuot, opinions of rabbis about how far communities should and shouldn't go towards redeeming captives. From the Cairo Geniza, some of you all heard of the Cairo Geniza, the great discovery in Cairo in the latter part of the 19th century, a treasure trove of documents from the Middle Ages detailing Jewish life throughout the Islamic world. We have letters written by some of the greatest rabbis of that period, determining how money should be released, or demanding, begging, cajoling communities to raise additional funds to redeem Jews who have been taken prisoner unlawfully. Now it's interesting, the cantor mentioned in his talk this evening about Abraham and his 318 servants, and the gematria of 318 corresponds to Eliezer, his major domo, his main servant. Okay. So the first text I've shown isn't a halachic text per se. I didn't know the cantor was going to deal with it, but we're going to show that gematria is gematria. But when you're going to war, you need more than just one Eliezer. Okay? This is a statement. This is a section from Breshit, chapter 14, a very famous one. All right. By the way, I put the Hebrew and the English source in there, but for the sake of time this evening, we're just going to concentrate on the English one. Remember, we've only learned about Abraham 2 chapters earlier. Okay? When Abraham heard of his kinsmen that had been taken captive, he's referring to his nephew Lot. He mustered his retainers, born his household, numbering 318, and went in pursuit as far as Dan. Okay? To the north. Dan is in the north of what would be the north of Israel today. At night he and his servants deployed against them and defeated them, and he pursued them as far as Hava, which is north of Damascus. Meaning he didn't just roll into what is now northern Israel. He went hundreds of miles north of where he was living at the time, which, by the way, was more in the center of the country. He brought back all the possessions. He also brought back his kinsman's lot and his possessions, the women, and the rest of the people. Again, so it wasn't just Lot that was taken captive, but his whole household and all of his retainers as well. Now, the backdrop of this is that Abraham at this point was kind of a nobody. I mean, he had this crazy idea about God, but the point of this is that he took it upon himself to liberate his nephew, who had been caught up in this rebellion of several kings within the land of Canaan, among several other kings, and he was kind of in the middle. And early on, this is established, and some of the Mefarshim the commentators make the statement about the importance of the mitzvah of Pidyon Shvuyim, redeeming of captives. Now, in the halakhic literature, I want to, the Jewish legal sources that guide our that guide our thinking on this, we're going to see, well, I'm going to argue, is we're going to see two distinct trends. A severe warning, after, of course, establishing the significance of the mitzvah, the overarching responsibility to redeem captives, a great concern about overpaying and the reasons why they are so concerned, which are probably self-evident. But at the same time, we're also going to see a trend towards evading the strict rule of the early sources that said be very careful about overpaying. And what we know from the lived experience of Jews, that they paid exorbitant amounts, just as we do today, to free those who have been unlawfully imprisoned. Everybody, any questions so far? Okay. So on one hand, it's a big mitzvah. Even in a tradition, and you've heard me say this all many times, even in a tradition that does not like to rank the mitzvot. How many times over the years have you heard me say that? Even in a tradition that does not like to rank one mitzvah, one commandment, as being more important, if there's a general exception to this klal, to this principle, it is pidyon shvuyim, the redemption of unlawfully held prisoners. And it's because of that that liberties were taken with the strict interpretation of the law, and indeed guides our behavior today. I would like, I'm going to just jump out of order here. You said put little numbers in parentheses next to the sources. I want you to jump to the top of page 2, source number 3. One of the perhaps most famous Mishnayot, regarding this particular subject, found in the Masechet, the tractate, the section of the Gemara known as Gittin, having to do, of all places, with Jewish divorce law, which some of you know I know a thing or two. The larger context is a series of rulings that are put in place to establish something called Tikkun Olam. Okay? Not in the way that Tikkun Olam is used in a current context, which means whatever people say it means to fit their own political perspective or viewpoint on world or social issues, but in its original context. By the way, I did not mean to be overly snarky, but it is late, and you know that I'm not very good at staying up past 9 o'clock at night. Tikkun Olam has to do with the way society should be ordered for the benefit of its citizens. There's a way of establishing the world. Okay? Like, for example, in our own time, we don't let 14-year-olds buy beer, mipnei tikkun olam, because it's just not good for society. Okay? There are many of us who believe, like, we probably shouldn't let 18-year-olds buy submachine guns, mipnei tikkun olam, for the good of society. You get the drift, right? So the Mishnah says, captives are not to be redeemed for more than their actual monetary value, mipnei tikkun olam, literally for the betterment of the world. That's how this one particular translation translates it. It's not a bad one. I like mine better. Again, to establish a certain working order that works for the common good. Okay? Or to paraphrase Spock in Star Trek II, it's only logical that the needs of the many live long and prosper, John. Yes, and by the way, this was stolen from the Jewish people. Okay? And yes, for the Trekkies. Okay? Captain Kirk represented wasps, and Uhura represented the third world, and Spock represented the Jews. And one may not aid the captives in their, should they attempt to escape from their captors, also mipnei tikkun olam, which is odd, which seems counterintuitive. We'll get to that a little bit later. Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel says, for the betterment of the I'm sorry, I skipped a line. May not aid the captives in their attempt to escape from their captors for the betterment of the world, meaning so that the kidnappers, those who have taken them prisoner unlawfully, will not be more restrictive with their captives to prevent them from escaping. That is to say, they're already getting treated terribly. If people are escaping, they're going to treat the captives even worse. And Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says it means that we don't aid them, not for tikkun olam, for the betterment of the world, but rather, in this more limited, for the sake of the captives themselves. So the kidnappers will not avenge the captives by treating the other captives with greater cruelty. Okay? Now go back to text. Now go back to text number 2 on the previous page. From the section, now again, chronologically, and there are many ways to study halakha. I like to study halakha chronologically, just to show the development over time, where later generations are in sync with previous generations, or where, and it happens all the time in halakha, where later generations reverse or overrule, or reverse or overrule without admitting they're reversing or overruling. Is that fair? Or reverse or overruling the previous generations. From Baba Batra, that Pidyon Shuyim mitzvah rabbahi, that redeeming captives is a great mitzvah. Now text number 4. By the way, my dear friends, this is hardly an exhaustive survey of every halachic every halachic source on the subject. I would need to do a whole tikkun of 4 or 5 hours to go through all that. But just some review of some of the prominent and famous ones, because I want us to be able to have a little bit of understanding of this, okay? From the section known as Ketubot, text number 4. All right? Now again, this is a section from the Gemara, and one of the functions of the Gemara is to address, discuss, elucidate, and enhance our understanding of subjects in general, but especially items in the Mishnah that preceded it. And one thing, I didn't make this clear, which I probably should have. The Mishnah, for all intents and purposes, was our first law code after the Torah itself. And the beginning of Rabbinic Judaism, to some degree, has to do with the writing of the oral tradition into the Mishnah as we understand it today. Source number 4. One does not redeem captives at more than their value. Again, the idea is that we want to get our prisoners back. How much do we pay without jeopardizing other values? This policy is for the betterment of the world. Again, tikkun olam. Because if captives are ransomed at exorbitant prices, this will encourage their captors to kidnap more people. Now, I want you to think real hard. What nation has to deal with this on a regular basis? Israel. in the years that I've been the rabbi of this community, just the last 26 years, there have been 3 or 4 tremendously lopsided, but just in terms of a person-to-person kind of thingy. This isn't like at the end of a declared war where there's an exchange of prisoners where a one-to-one parity is not necessarily goal. I'm country X and you're country Y. We fought a war. One of us has won. It's not important which one right now. And our interest is to get back our prisoners as your interest is to get back your prisoners. But in just the years that I've been here, there have been several lopsided prisoner exchanges which really have shook the Jewish world. If captives are ransomed at exorbitant prices, this will encourage their captors to kidnap more people. How much effort does Hamas, for example, place in its mission to kidnap Israelis, especially soldiers? Without getting too political tonight, that's really not my purpose or my goal tonight. About 10 days ago, Israel starched a very significant leader of the Iranian Revolutionary Guards. Anybody read about that? Okay. All right. Why did they do that, and why were they not particularly quiet about it? Because the Israeli government let it be known that this person was not only involved in all kinds of things against Israel, but in the attempt to kidnap Israelis traveling throughout places like Europe, Turkey, and Cyprus. Why does Israel want to prevent the kidnapping of its citizens in these places? Because in time, every Israeli government has had to pay the lopsided prices. And too many times, again, but I'm not making a halakhic statement, I'm just saying it in practice. There have been too many times when those who have been released from Israeli jails have gone on to commit more terrorist attacks of the very type for which they were originally imprisoned, some of which have caused not just destruction and injury, but actual death. Perhaps most notably, there have been several murders of Israelis in terrorist incidents associated with the 1,000 or so prisoners that were released for Gilad Shalit several years ago. Again, not taking a position right now, whether it was a good idea or a bad idea, simply saying as a matter of fact that terrorists released during that exchange went on to commit other terrorist attacks that killed many more Israelis. That's an incontrovertible fact. Because and as Ketubot warns, if they ransom for more exorbitant prices, this will encourage their captors to kidnap more, which is the priority of so many of Israel's enemies. Now the Gemara notes, this implies that if the captors seek a ransom in accordance with their actual value, one does redeem captives, even though this includes a case where a woman's redemption is more than her wedding contract. I want you to leave that out for the side only because, as important as it is, it'll pull us off subject tonight. Now, I would like you to go on to we're going to do the next source. It's a longer source from a very, very important source, the Mishnah Torah of Maimonides, probably the most comprehensive law code that anybody has ever written on Jewish law. As you might imagine, as a community leader, at a time when captives taking prisoners was so popular, Maimonides knew this from the theoretical as well as the practical end as well. He also on this begins with the redemption of captives held for ransom takes precedence over sustaining the poor and clothing them. You will not find a mitzvah greater than the redemption of captives, for captivity is in the same category as famine, drought, or exposure, and one stands in danger to one's life. One who averts his eyes from redeeming the captive transgresses the commandment. Do not harden your heart and shut your hands, and do not stand idly by your brother's blood. Now skip to the next page, in the middle of page 4, please, where it says section 11. Can you all see that? If the people of the city have collected money for the building of a synagogue, and a matter of mitzvah comes before them, they should use the money for the mitzvah in this case being the redemption of captives. But if they already purchased stones and beams, they should only sell them in the case of redeeming captives. Even if they have bought the stones and made walls of them, beams and laid them out, and they sell it all for the sake of redeeming captives, and that alone. But if they've built and completed the synagogue, they do not sell the synagogue, where they collect for their captives redemption from the public. I mean, that you're saying that you need to go to great lengths, but not ultimate lengths for this particular. Now, why would one make the point where you could sell part of it hasn't been constructed, but if the building's already built, you wouldn't be able to sell it for this purpose, if we just went on and on about what a great mitzvah this is? Let me share something with you that I hope that I can expect effectively and clearly. Institutions exist to serve the people who support those institutions. That kind of makes sense, right? Like take the synagogue, for example. Why does it exist? The synagogue exists because a group of people in this part of New Jersey want this synagogue to exist, right? Just like a group of people in Fair Lawn want a synagogue to exist there, and a group of people in Metuchen want a synagogue to exist there. Everybody with me so far? But once the synagogue is built, what happens? The synagogue as an entity has an interest of its own separate from the people, or that may or may not accord with the interests of the people who actually support it. Do you understand what I mean? Let me give you an example. Years ago, when security needs demanded people pay more for the security of the building, you may recall at open congregational meetings, some people were very unhappy about having to pay for it. Maybe, nobody here, of course, but somebody remembers some of the open congregational meetings about an assessment for security. Somebody remember that going back 7, 8, 9, 10 years ago? Well, this synagogue as its own entity has to make decisions about security that may not accord with everybody else's sense of security or political beliefs or what have you. That is to say, the synagogue has to assert an independent need of some of its members who might not have agreed for the need for a policeman, or the need for the assessment, or the need for this, or the need for that. Make sense? As opposed to, let's say, example. What I'm saying is that the Jewish community as an entity, or its leadership, may have interests at variance with some of the people who are part of that community. Meaning that, in this case, a synagogue, once it's built, if it's still in construction, if it's still in its construction stage, well, you may be able to pull parts out of it to redeem captives. But once the synagogue is built, as important as the mitzvah of redeeming captives actually is, the larger community still needs a place to pray, even though, God forbid, there are captives out there. And that's what Maimonides is referring to, trying to establish the limits on how far community should go or has to go to secure those prisoners. Does that make sense to everybody? I know it's late, but I'm going to wind this down in about 5 minutes. But does that make sense to everybody? Yes, no, a little bit? Excellent. Section 12. They may not redeem captives for more than their worth, for the sake of civilization. That's that Tikkun Olam thing, okay? So that the enemies will not pursue after them to enslave them once they find out they are willing to pay anything. And they do not try to make the captives escape for the sake of their civilization, so that the enemies will not increase the weight of the yoke and add more guards. Okay? So those rulings seem to be consistent. Let's jump ahead a little bit. I want you to jump to page 6 and look at the bottom, subparagraph 6. I want you to just take a look at that quickly, because it's most akin to something that many Americans ask when Americans are unlawfully taken prisoner outside this nation. And if you've never asked it, you're a better person than I am. Which is something like, what the heck was that person doing in that place, doing there in the first place? Anybody ever think like that? Good. So I'm not the only rotten person in the room today. I'm sorry, you'll forgive me. But sometimes, like for example, I don't understand why people insisted on going on backpack trips to sections of Iraq and Syria which were under ISIS control at the time. I don't get it. Now, I know you're thinking, Rabbi, you don't travel anywhere anyway. But if I did, I sure as heck wouldn't start there. And I'm a firm believer, I've talked about this and I've written about this. I don't believe that any American, especially any American Jew, should ever go to a place where they think their American passport can't save them. In fact, my Shabbat message to that effect, 18 months, was the highest number of reads of any column that I ever wrote. It's the closest thing in halakha I've been able to find that's akin to that one. What the heck were they doing there in the first place? The one that sells themselves to a heathen, or who borrowed from them and is held by them for non-payment, should be ransomed the first time and even the second time. Meaning, we're not going to beat up on them for being dumb enough to be put in that position in the first place. By the way, that's my own loose translation. It's not exactly what it says, but that's the emphasis. Meaning that the fact that they put themselves in a vulnerable position is not significant halachically. Not the first time, not the second time. But not if it happens in a third time. I mean, there's only so many times a person can engage in high-risk behavior that the community has to come to their rescue. But his children should be ransomed after the father's death. I mean, but the community still has an obligation to the children. However, if his life is in danger, he must be ransomed immediately, no matter how many times it has happened. Number 7, Rabbi Yuval Shurlo, who wrote a series of essays that were highly influential in Israel about the disconnect between the halachic literature, which seems to it says quite clearly, don't be very careful about, we got to get our captives back, but don't incentivize the taking of the next batch of captives. And what Israel has to go through, the calculus that Israel has to go through when its soldiers or citizens are taken prisoner. And indeed, what our own great nation is trying to figure out, because we have dozens, if not hundreds, of Americans unlawfully held prisoner all throughout the world. And I say this with great respect. Most of whom are not a fraction as famous as some of the ones that have been taken in recent years. He writes, the impact on the morale of the army could be significant. Once a soldier knows that the state will not do everything it can to free him, including a willingness to release murderers in exchange for his freedom, it will diminish his motivation to fight. Let me share with you something. The last big lopsided prison exchange, the Gilad Shalit, about 1,000 terrorists, hundreds of whom have been convicted of murder, released for Gilad Shalit, the remains of 2 other soldiers, and 1 or 2 other prisoners. Do you know that almost every major religious authority in Israel, from what we'll call the Orthodox community, from the conservative community, from the Reform community, almost everyone to a person opposed the deal? Yet over 71% of Israel's military officers and at least 70% of Israel's population. Rabbi Sherlow was hit right here on the head. The impact on the morale of the army could be significant. Every Israeli soldier goes into battle knowing that the Israeli government is going to do some crazy things to get them back. Among them, things which, upon review, may be heartbreaking, but may not be as crazy as we have the luxury of analyzing this evening. Last text, which I found somewhere. Michelle Obama's remarks at an afternoon Hanukkah reception 2014. I want to begin today with wonderful news. This has to do with Alan Gross, an American engineer who is being held unlawfully in Cuba. Allegations that he may have been, or at one time was, or may have been used by American intelligence services. I don't know, so I'm not speculating. Just saying that he was unlawfully held in prison in Cuba 5 or 6 years, and our government made very big efforts to get him released. I want to begin with wonderful news today. I'm told that in the Jewish tradition, one of the great mitzvahs is Pidyon Shvuyim. Applause. My Hebrew is not perfect, but I get points for trying. But it describes the redemption, the freeing of captives. And that's what we're celebrating today, because after being unjustly held in Cuba for more than 5 years, American Alan Gross is free. I'll simply end by saying the American people have never been told exactly what they had to give to Cuba for Mr. Gross's return. Again, I'm not saying what they paid was exorbitant. I'm not saying they shouldn't have done it. But such is the tension. How do we go about getting our prisoners? And how do we do so in a way that does not jeopardize or incentivize the taking of the next round? Again, something that our sages dealt with not only on the theoretical level, but as I mentioned at the beginning, sadly, on the practical level as well. And this is not just relegated to ancient times and medieval times. It's one that our secular authorities and our Jewish authorities still must contend with. Thank you for coming out this evening. And may it be Hashem's will that we have the luxury in our time to discuss them and analyze them from a theoretical basis only. Thanks all for coming out tonight. We're glad to have you all with us. Please feel free to keep the sources if you like, or you can bring them back up and I'll collect them. We look forward to seeing you tomorrow at 9:30 for our Shavuot Day 1 services.